morning, everybody! Good morning, it's JPR, and welcome back to the Pokemon Type History series. Today's topic of interest, as you already know, is the Ice type, a type that I think most casual fans probably don't see any issue with. When most people think of the worst types out there, typically stuff like Grass, Bug, and Poison, the early game types, come to mind. Ice, typically being a more late game type with a reputation as the Dragon Slaying type for many years, may have given people a false impression of how good this type really was. But truthfully, Game Freak for most of its history has been giving it the cold shoulder. I am never going to make it through one of these type intros without a bad pun, am I? Now, offensively speaking, Ice is no slouch, beating Dragon, Flying, Grass, and Ground, all super relevant types, not just in the main story, but in competition as well. However, Ice is notably the least resistant of all types, only resisting itself. Sure, Normal has no resistances, but it at least has an immunity to Ghost, which is way better. Its poor defense makes this type one of the least versatile, since there's not a lot of situations where you can safely switch in or set up with one. Back in the day, my dad always used to tell me that defense won Super Bowls, and I said, that's great, Dad, but I'm playing Pokemon on my Game Boy, I don't really care. But now, after looking at Ice, I kinda see what he means. See, you would think Ice could be pretty good since it has its own status with Freeze and its own weather condition with Hail, but truthfully, these are both at the bottom of their respective categories. Freeze is pretty much a crapshoot of a status condition, since it can go away instantly. Sure, it could last like 8 turns or something, which it conveniently did the last time I challenged the Battle Tower, thank you for that game. But honestly, the lack of consistency is what makes this status so underwhelming. Not counting Confusion, the only other status that isn't permanent is Sleep, but that at least guarantees one turn where the opponent can't act. With Freeze, it's like, oh wow, that 10% chance actually worked! Oh wait, it's gone already, nothing actually happened. On top of that, you can instantly thaw yourself out by using a variety of hot moves, including Scald and Flare Blitz, which are exceptionally common moves in competitive play. As for Hail, unlike other weather conditions, the only benefit Ice types get from it is that they don't take a small amount of chip damage at the end of every turn. Sandstorm at least gives Rock types a 30% special defense boost, and Sun and Rain give a massive 50% power boost to their respective types. For the longest time, the only two abilities that directly benefited from Hail were Snow Cloak and Ice Body. Both definitely not as useful as the other weather-based abilities like Sand Force, Chlorophyll, or Swift Swim. Some more buffs would later arrive, but we'll talk about those in a few minutes. For now, let's rewind the clock to the very beginning. Gen 1, arguably the best generation for Ice types. In Gen 1, Ice types were actually neutral against Fire-type Pokemon, which meant that Charizard and Moltres had a weakness to Ice. Additionally, Gen 1 Blizzard, as many of you know, was completely broken. With 120 power and 90% accuracy, I have to wonder how anybody gave this the green light back then. I mean, they at least had the common sense to nerf Blizzard in the international versions. As in Japanese Red and Green, Blizzard had a 30% chance to freeze instead of 10%. So pretty much any Pokemon that could run this move in Gen 1 could be considered a threat. Even in a relatively small top tier, Cloyster, Jinx, and Lapras all managed to make the cut this gen, with Articuno not being too far out. Since the only types that resisted Ice were Water and Ice itself, this made it an incredibly difficult offensive type to deal with. The cracks in the foundation definitely started showing in Gen 2 though. Blizzard was nerfed to the 70% accuracy it still retains today, making Ice Beam take over as the popular Ice move of choice. Still a really good option for most Ice types to run though. Unfortunately, none of the new Gen 2 Ice types were all that good, as Piloswine, Delibird, and Sneasel were all far less than stellar Pokemon. I mean, come on, Delibird is literally just a gimmick, it barely counts. The only new Ice moves introduced were Icy Wind and Powder Snow, neither of which were really shaking up the meta. Of course, Steel was introduced as yet another weakness for them, and they lost their neutral interaction with Fire. With nothing new to work with, Ice was essentially just a weaker version of itself from the previous generation. Things really began to melt away in the tropical region of Hoenn though. Sure, Walrein, Glalie, and Regice are way better than the Gen 2 Pokemon that were introduced, but all of them failed to make a mark on the meta. And if we're strictly talking main story, then none of them are really worth going for, aside from maybe Walrein, who has to compete with a ton of other water types. Glalie just evolves way too late for a Pokemon with such mediocre stats, and Regice is a pain to find and level up in general. Not to mention, you can't find any Ice types in Hoenn until you're nearly at the 7th gym, so they aren't able to help against Winona, which is only one of 2 winning matchups they have in all of Hoenn, the other being Drake. But jumping back into the competitive side of things, Cloyster is the only ice type left in the top tier. And that's mostly due to its role as a support Pokemon. It's not really a Pokemon that's going to jump on the front lines and start battling against Dragonite and Salamence. In fact, Cloyster's viability at this point has much more to do with it being part water, not ice. Gen 4 would serve as a small blessing for ice types though. Finally, they would be gifted with 2 usable offensive threats with Mamoswine and Weavile. Mamoswine could serve as a good supporting lead, and Weavile of course is the glass cannon the type always needed to take advantage of its great offensive presence. And of course, this was much needed with dragons peeking around that time, as we mentioned in the Dragon History video. Unfortunately, not all ice types were so lucky though. Unlike Steel, which greatly benefited from a new meta that revolved around entry hazards, Ice suffered greatly. Stealth Rocks were not good news at all. At the time, there was no levitating ice types that weren't also flying type, like Articuno, who would just get murdered by Stealth Rock. Even now, the only ice levitators are Cryogonal and Rotom Frost, neither of which I would advise using. And of course, there's never been any such thing as an ice poison type Pokemon, so there's no way to get past Toxic Spikes either. Gens 5 and 6 though were back to basics. Almost every ice type introduced in these 2 generations were painfully bad. About the only mildly interesting thing to come out of this time period was Freeze Dry, a move that could deal super effective damage against water types, which at least breathed some life into some of the lesser ice types. But this still wasn't nearly enough. This was the time in Pokemon history where almost every other type was evolving and getting better at a rapid pace, whereas ice felt the same as it had been in Gen 4. Weavile and Mamoswine were still the only consistent contenders. Maybe they should stop making slow, tanky ice types that aren't actually tanky. Well, at least they introduced Avalugg in this time frame, a Pokemon that I can point at and go, "Here, look at it! This is the embodiment of everything wrong with ice!" Gen 7 is where Game Freak ultimately decided to whip out the big guns though. This was their final stand to make ice great again. Totally not to rip off anything else that may have been happening in the year 2016. Alolan Ninetales was introduced as the first good hail setter, maybe ever. Aurora Veil was introduced as a widespread TM that gave ice types both Reflect and Light Screen in the hail. Slush Rush, the ice equivalent of Chlorophyll and Swift Swim, was introduced, and was conveniently given to like all the slowest Pokemon it barely makes a difference on. And after all of those changes, ice was finally mediocre at best. But at least not in the bottom 2 or 3 anymore. Crabominable didn't really help though, that's all I'm gonna say about that. And so Sword and Shield just kinda said, wait a minute, what are we doing? Let's just make ice types that are incredibly broken and call it a day. And thus Galarian Darmanitan and Calyrex Ice Rider were born. Which is kind of funny because Glastrier on his own is pretty bad. It's actually the grass psychic type on his back that makes him good. The only really interesting developments from this gen come from Legends Arceus though. No, not through Hisuian Avalugg, he still sucks. But mostly through the reworking of the hail and freeze conditions, now known as snow and frostbite respectively. These conditions are so much better than the old ones. Frostbite is basically the special version of burn, which is miles better than the old random chance to stay frozen. Snow, unlike hail, will not do damage to any Pokemon on the field, but it will raise the speed of all ice types and increase the chance of inflicting the frostbite condition, which is pretty important given that unlike other statuses, there's never been a move that guarantees the opponent to be frozen or frostbitten. I really hope for Ice's sake that these 2 conditions stay this way for the next generation, because that alone would be a tremendous help. Of course, it can't just stop there though. First of all, if we are to assume that the type chart will never change again, then there needs to be a huge paradigm shift in the way Game Freak designs new ice types going forward. We can't keep getting these slow defensive Pokemon that aren't able to use their defenses because of poor defensive typing. We need more Pokemon like Weavile that can take advantage of Ice's strong offensive side. Or at the very least, more good support Pokemon like Alolan Ninetales, just so the type doesn't get too one-dimensional. A good, fast special attacker is especially needed because, ironically enough, most ice types can't really utilize Ice Beam or Blizzard as well as other types can, due to the fact that almost all of the viable ice attackers are physical. On that note, we also need better, more reliable physical ice options. Ice Punch at 75 power and 100% accuracy is the most reliable, but is struggling to keep up with the other types that have more damage output. The only other physical ice moves with any utility at all are Icicle Crash, which has 90% accuracy, Icicle Spear, which only applies to a few Pokemon like Cloyster that can negate the RNG factor with its hidden ability Skill Link, and Triple Axle, which also involves a fair bit of RNG, but is at least the strongest physical ice move on average. Basically, none of these options are fully reliable, which is another reason why people are so hesitant to bet on ice types as their damage dealers. Well, again, aside from Calyrex, but that's just VGC. Heck man, it took 8 years for Black Kyurem to finally reach Uber solely because he had no good physical ice moves for the longest time. And it's worth noting he still can't learn Ice Punch, he has to rely on Icicle Spear of all things. We talked a good bit about how Water stole some of Grass's spotlight in the Grass type video a few months ago, but honestly, Water steals even more from Ice. Almost every good Water type can run Ice Beam, Ice Punch, or any other reliable Ice type move without having the drawback of actually being an Ice type. To be honest, I think Ice just deserves to resist Water, which I'm aware doesn't really make a lot of sense because if you put ice in your water, then it's gonna melt, but still, they need something defensively for them to ever become a worthwhile type. But hey, sometimes that's just the way the cookie crumbles. Shout out to my amazing channel members, as always, thank you guys so much for your support, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe for more videos just like this one and leave a like down below. I'll see you guys next time.